In March 2000, an ordinary workplace in Irving, Texas, turned into the site of one of the most shocking massacres the state had ever seen. What began as a routine morning at a small neighborhood car wash ended in horror, leaving 5 innocent people dead, 1 critically injured, and an entire community forever scarred. The victims were not strangers to one another. They were co-workers, people who laughed together, unlocked doors side by side, and prepared for a day of honest work. But within minutes, the sound of friendly chatter would be replaced with gunshots, and the car wash floor would become a crime scene drenched in fear and tragedy. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated act of execution carried out by a man with a violent past and a burning grudge. Victims were forced to the ground and shot at point-blank range. One was savagely slashed across the throat. The youngest killed was just 15 years old, robbed of a future before it even began. The man responsible was Robert Wayne Harris, a recently hired employee who turned his resentment into cold-blooded murder. But Harris's story didn't begin that morning. Behind the trigger was a man shaped by years of instability, a troubled past, and choices that drew him closer and closer to violence. To understand how a job loss led to a massacre, how Harris became one of Texas's most infamous death row inmates, and what his final words were before lethal injection, we need to trace the events back, step by step. From his childhood, to his first killing, to the day he destroyed 5 families inside a modest Texas car wash. Robert Wayne Harris entered the world on February 28, 1972, in Dallas County, Texas. He was the second of several children, born into a household where stability was never guaranteed. His childhood was marked by instability, frequent moves, strained relationships, and an environment where structure and guidance were in short supply. His parents' relationship was fractured. Sometimes they stayed together, but often they were apart, leaving Robert and his siblings caught in the middle. Constant relocations meant Harris rarely remained in one school, long enough to build lasting friendships. Teachers described him as a quiet boy who often sat in the back of the classroom, withdrawn from others. But those same teachers also noted something troubling, moments when his silence gave way to sudden, explosive outbursts, especially when he felt mocked or cornered. Classmates remembered him as a boy who rarely smiled, someone who carried a sense of distance even among peers. By middle school, the cracks in his education were impossible to ignore. He struggled to read at grade level, his math skills lagged behind, and his attendance was inconsistent. Eventually, he drifted further away from school until he stopped showing up entirely. By his teenage years, Harris had no diploma, no career path, and very few options. The jobs available to him were limited to low-paying, labor-intensive work, scrubbing cars, hauling trash, or mopping floors. Even these opportunities slipped away as quickly as they came, since Harris often clashed with supervisors or failed to show up altogether. It was during this period that his criminal record began to form. At first, it was petty theft, taking things he believed no one would miss. Soon, the offenses escalated to misdemeanor assaults, and eventually, indecent exposure. Police reports and probation files painted a picture of a man who was impulsive, unstable, and prone to reckless decisions. When Harris was evaluated by the court, his IQ was measured at just 68, placing him within the range of intellectual disability. In theory, this diagnosis could have opened the door to intervention, counseling, or support programs. But in reality, it was nothing more than a number written on a page. Harris continued drinking heavily, picking fights, and sinking deeper into the margins of society. By the late 1990s, Robert Wayne Harris was living in Irving, Texas. He was in his late 20s working odd jobs and carrying a growing bitterness toward the world. Every setback seemed to fuel his resentment, and every personal failure added to his sense of being wronged. It was a dangerous mix, a man with little to lose, simmering anger, and a history of violence that was about to turn deadly. On the night of November 29, 1999, the streets of Irving, Texas were quiet, cloaked in darkness. But for Robert Wayne Harris, it was the night he crossed a line that could never be undone. His target was 37-year-old Sandra Scott, a woman from his neighborhood, familiar, approachable, and known for her easy smile. To most, Sandra was a friendly face in the community. To Harris, she had become an enemy. In his mind, Sandra had betrayed him. He believed she had stolen money from him, a suspicion that was never proven. But whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that Harris believed it, and once the thought took root, it consumed him. His anger transformed into obsession, and that obsession became deadly intent. Harris abducted Sandra, pulling her away from the safety of her home and her community. There was no negotiation, no chance for her to escape. At some point during that abduction, Harris raised his gun and pulled the trigger. The shot ended her life instantly. Later, when asked about the murder, Harris admitted it without hesitation. He explained flatly that he killed Sandra because he thought she had taken money from him. As if that reasoning was justification enough for execution, Sandra Scott's death could have been the turning point, the moment where law enforcement intervened, recognized Harris's capacity for lethal violence, and ensured he would never harm again. But it wasn't. He walked away from the crime, free and unpunished, carrying no visible burden of guilt. In fact, the act seemed to embolden him. Killing Sandra had not satisfied his rage. It had only shown him how easy it was to take a life. And in the months that followed, Harris's bitterness only deepened. He struggled to keep work, clashed with people around him, and carried a growing sense that the world had wronged him. Then came the incident that pushed him over the edge, his sudden firing from the job he thought he needed most. In early March 2000, Harris was employed at the Mi-Fine Car Wash in Irving. It was modest work, the kind of job that demanded long hours but provided steady pay. But Harris's time there came to an abrupt end when a female customer accused him of masturbating in front of her. Management had no choice. They fired him immediately. For most people, it would have been an embarrassing setback. For Harris, it was humiliation, rejection, and betrayal wrapped into one. He wasn't just unemployed, he was angry, and in his mind he had been disrespected. That humiliation began to fester into something darker: revenge. Within weeks, that anger would erupt in one of the most shocking workplace massacres in Texas history. It was the morning of March 15, 2000. The Mi-Fine Car Wash in Irving, Texas, had just opened its doors for business. Workers gathered inside, unlocking supply closets, preparing hoses, and sharing small talk before the first customers arrived. For them, it was just another workday. For Robert Wayne Harris, it was the day he had chosen for revenge. At around 7:30 a.m., Harris arrived at the car wash carrying a .38 caliber revolver and a knife. He wasn't there to work, and he wasn't there to talk. He was there to kill. Inside, 5 employees were beginning their shifts. Among them were 46-year-old assistant manager Dennis Lee, 48-year-old cashier Mary Moreno, 32-year-old Rudy Ruiz, 36-year-old Jose Valencia, and 15-year-old Jeremy Guerrero, a high school student who had taken the part-time job to help his family. Also present was a 6th man, 23-year-old Jorge Bernal, who would become the sole survivor of Harris's attack. Harris stormed in, waving the revolver, his voice sharp and threatening. He ordered everyone to the ground, his rage boiling over. The employees obeyed, terrified, not yet realizing the full extent of his intentions. One by one, Harris began executing them. At point-blank range, he fired at Rudy Ruiz, killing him instantly. He then turned the gun on Mary Moreno, who collapsed after the shot. Dennis Lee and Jose Valencia were next, both shot in cold blood, with no chance to fight back. The brutality didn't end there. Harris pulled his knife and slashed the throat of young Jeremy Guerrero. The teenager, barely old enough to drive, had come in that morning expecting nothing more than a few hours of honest work. Instead, he was slaughtered in a frenzy of rage. Amid the chaos, Jorge Bernal begged for his life. Harris shot him as well, but somehow Jorge survived. Bleeding heavily, he lay still, pretending to be dead. His decision to remain motionless, despite the pain, would prove critical, not only to his survival but also to identifying Harris later. The entire massacre lasted only minutes, but the carnage left behind was unspeakable. When Harris fled the scene, 5 people lay dead inside the car wash. Their families would soon be shattered by the news, their loved ones stolen in an act of senseless violence. It didn't take long for police to connect the dots. Investigators quickly learned Harris had been fired just days earlier. The surviving witness, Jorge Bernal, told detectives that Harris was the shooter. With that testimony, combined with Harris's known resentment toward the car wash, law enforcement launched a manhunt. Within 48 hours, Harris was located and arrested. In custody, he showed little remorse. In fact, he confessed with chilling bluntness. He told police that after being fired, he felt humiliated and disrespected. Killing his former coworkers, he said, was his way of getting even. But his confession didn't end there. Shockingly, Harris also admitted to murdering Sandra Scott months earlier, the killing that had gone unsolved. It was a revelation that confirmed what investigators already suspected. Robert Wayne Harris was not just a workplace killer. He was a man who had already tasted blood and found himself capable of doing it again. By the time the interrogation ended, prosecutors had more than enough evidence to pursue the death penalty. Harris had left behind witnesses, ballistic proof, and his own words sealing his fate. Robert Wayne Harris's arrest brought a wave of relief to Irving, but for the families of the victims, it was only the start of a long and painful road through the justice system. Within days, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimony, Harris's own admissions, and the brutality of the crime itself. During his trial in 2000, jurors heard every detail of the massacre. Survivors described lying on the floor, hearing gunshots one after another, waiting for their turn to die. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, forced to relive their worst nightmares as photographs and forensic evidence were presented. Prosecutors painted Harris as a man consumed by rage, a former employee who decided to punish innocent workers for his own failures. The defense tried to argue that Harris's low IQ, just 68, meant he lacked the intellectual capacity to fully understand his actions. They spoke of his unstable childhood, his learning disabilities, and his struggles with mental health, but the jury was unmoved. The facts of the case were too stark, the killings too deliberate. After only a short deliberation, Harris was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. For the next 12 years, Harris remained on death row at the Pulaski unit in Livingston, Texas. His appeals argued the same points: intellectual disability, mental health, and ineffective representation, but one by one, each was denied. Courts ruled that despite his low IQ, Harris knew right from wrong, and he had acted with clear intent. The executions of 5 men in one morning could not be explained. Away as impulse, it was a calculated act of revenge. Finally, in 2012, the date was set. On September 20th, 2012, Robert Wayne Harris was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. Family members of the victims watched from behind the glass, waiting for justice they had been promised 12 long years ago. When asked for a final statement, Harris looked at the witnesses and spoke with a quiet voice. He said, "I love you all. I'll see you on the other side." Then he turned his head toward the families of his victims and added, "I'm sorry for what I did. It was a simple apology. Too little, too late." Moments later, the lethal injection began. At 6:43 p.m., Robert Wayne Harris was pronounced dead. For the families, there were no celebrations, only tears. Justice had been served, but the pain of losing loved ones never truly faded. For Irving, Texas, the memory of the Mi-Fine Car Wash Massacre remained etched in history, a chilling reminder of how one man's anger destroyed so many lives in just a matter of minutes. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Hit that bell icon so you never miss the next chilling case.